On the ExpertsConnect podcast, we have thought-provoking conversations with top-performing experts on topics that matter to you. With ExpertsConnect, you'll uncover fascinating facts and gain the necessary skills you'll need to improve all aspects of your life. James is a global economist at HSBC. He joined the economics team in 2013, having previously worked within the asset allocation research team. His global work focuses on longer-term trends and themes and the impact that they have on the economy and policy decisions today. Demographic data is at the heart of much of his work, but he has also written about urbanization, the role of technology in the economy, and how the world is moving away from cash. Alongside this, he provides economic coverage of Scandinavia. James holds a Bachelor of Science in Economics from the University of Bath. Hi James, how are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. It's a lovely spring day here in London.
Wonderful. And tell me, what is meant by the digital economy?
So the digital economy can be, I guess we can explain it in a number of ways. You can think about it in the simplest sense, which is people shopping online, people consuming digital products, be it your Netflix or your Spotify or whatever products you choose to use. But there's also a digital economy on the supply side, on the services side. So thinking about supply chains, thinking about automation and robotics, there's all of those things together. But for myself as an economist, the bit that's probably the most relevant is that sort of consumption angle, because that's where we're seeing the impacts most clearly in terms of what all of this means for the global economy.
Yeah, so when you say consumption angle, are you saying consumption online?
A bit of consumption online, but that comes in twofold. One is buying physical products online, and the second is consuming virtual products or digital products. And I think the combination of the growth in both of those sectors is extremely important.
Okay, great. And what exactly are the implications of the digital economy on job creation and loss?
It's really hard to say. So quite simply, in the first side of things, you can say there's a clear negative here because a lot of jobs are going to disappear as more people shop online, and therefore we don't go into physical stores, and online retail is considerably less labor intensive than physical retail. So naturally, we should see many fewer jobs out there on the sort of retail side of things. But then you've also got the big risk of automation. And I think in a lot of jobs and a lot of industries, a lot of processes are automated. And some of that is in those supply chains where businesses have realized, well, actually, we don't need people doing these jobs. We can find automated ways of doing it. The best example for most of us in the world is thinking about self-checkouts. Actually, if you can use a self-checkout, that's a job that is basically just disappears. But what's important, though, is there's a lot of jobs that don't get automated. In using the supermarket example, we haven't yet automated shelf stackers. I used to do that job when I was a teenager, and it is actually considerably harder to automate than you might necessarily think because you've got to think about rotation of stock, you've got to put things in the right order, right place. Actually, designing that robot is quite difficult. So you're not seeing all types of jobs being lost. But it's also important to stress that the digital economy creates a lot of jobs in itself. Think about all of those people who work in podcasts or in on YouTube or Netflix or any of these sorts of companies that have grown out of nothing as we've got a much more digital economy, as well as all the people who build the infrastructure. So even going back to like manufacturing, you've got a huge demand for semiconductors, you've got demand for producing digital technology. All of these things themselves help to grow jobs in a slightly different way. So it's not so simple. There's a lot of places where jobs will be lost, but there's also a lot of places where jobs will be created. And over time, I'm more of an optimist than most people. I think we'll create enough jobs, and there'll be a lot of new jobs that we don't even know, can't even comprehend today. They'll be pretty commonplace in 10 years' time.
Most definitely. And these new jobs will definitely require new digital skills.
Yeah, most definitely. And it's one of the big challenges I think policymakers across the world are going to have in the next 10 years and beyond is can you train people to have the skills that you need. And some of that is going to be the simple things, such as being digitally savvy. Do you have people who know how to use a computer well? Can people use the basics, Excel, Word, using how to communicate on email, using how to use social media effectively? All of these things are going to be genuinely important skills that I think for so long have been taken for granted. And on top of that, a bit more sort of knowledge of coding and those sorts of skills are going to be much, much more relevant in the next decade than they ever have been before. Learning how to code is going to be a commonplace skill, I think, in a lot of industries, whereas historically that's been something that has been a very niche skill set for certain parts of organizations. And it's something that's going to be far, far more important. But you've also got to think about if some of these new jobs that are being created by the digital economy are much more about content. And I think that's a part of the side of the economy that people often forget. And we sort of dismiss it as having almost sort of as real jobs, if that makes sense. Because what you're essentially doing in a digital economy is you give people more time. Actually, technology saves us all a lot of time. Going back to my self-checkout example, if your supermarket puts in 10 self-checkouts rather than 3 manned checkouts, well, actually, it means you go through the supermarket quicker. Now, that may only save you 10, 15 minutes. But what do you do with that 10, 15 minutes? Well, you probably consume content. And that actually creates a sort of a growth industry in some of these skills. And I think learning how to present yourself, learning how to use digital editing software, video editing software, audio editing software, those sorts of skills are going to be incredibly useful going forwards. And I think there's a whole range of new skills that as a population, we need to make sure we're learning much, much more intently than we have in the past.
I wholeheartedly agree with you. And how exactly does the digital economy, I know you said a bit in terms of like how the time, etc., but how does it affect the way we do business?
It affects things in a lot of ways, and I think one of the most interesting examples I think is this shift from physical to virtual or physical to digital in a lot of different ways. And the pandemic has accelerated a lot of that clearly in terms of face-to-face meetings, and we're starting to think about, well, actually, do we need to get on planes? Do we need to go and visit people as much when we can actually do video calls? And it's not the same, but it's a step in the right direction in terms of we can be much more efficient with the way we're doing a lot of things. And I think that's a really important part of it. There's also, I think, what we're going to see across the world is a big drop off in sort of physical shipments of items. I think this is something that a lot of people don't necessarily think about. We're moving to a world where instead of me buying a CD that is physically produced and sent somewhere on a boat, I just stream something on Spotify. It's a completely different business model. And people say, okay, that's just music. But what happens if we start to see similar things where our consumption of certain goods and services changes in a way that is much more virtual and digital rather than being physical? What does that mean for the demand for manufactured products, for commodities, for all of these things? I think could have a quite substantial impact. And it's very easy for me to sit here and say, well, more things are going to be digital in 10 years' time, but I don't know what they're going to be. If I did know, I'd certainly be investing in them. But if you went back 10 years and you said to someone, well, instead of me buying a CD, I'm going to have unlimited access to music on my phone, you just thought that was crazy. I remember going to the shops with my dad when I was a teenager, and we'd buy one CD a week, or we'd rent one CD a week from the library, and that was seen as like this amazing progress that we had in terms of access to music. Little did we think, 5, 6, 7 years later, for £10 or €10 or $10 a month, you can have unlimited access to music, and that sort of transformational change has massive implications for the economy, but also those industries involved.
Yeah. And what are your projections for the banking industry post COVID-19?
It's very tricky because there's clearly two things at play here. One is that digital payments are booming, and the pandemic has really accelerated that. And I've been for a long time a sort of anti-cash crusader to an extent. There's an argument that digital payments are really good for the world. They streamline things. They're a more effective way of doing business, of paying. They save costs. They save wastage in the economy. They're fantastic. And the pandemic has really accelerated digital payment usage because people, for one reason or another, have opted not to want to receive digital payments, or they've chosen not wanted to receive cash, or they've not wanted to use cash. And those two things together, partly because of fears of the virus spreading on notes or coins or whatever, has really turned the tide in terms of digital payments. And therefore, you're going to move towards a world that is so much more focused on digital payments going forward. And I think that's going to be a really interesting story, not just what's happened now, but what happens going forwards. We've always thought of digital payments of needing a tipping point. And for me, that tipping point is when businesses start saying we're not going to take cash. Because suddenly, if a few businesses start saying we're not going to take cash, then you don't take cash in your wallet, which
Yeah.
means next time you only pay with your card. And it really, really intensifies quite quickly. And we saw in Sweden in the course of the last decade, the share of payments in cash went from about 40, 50, 60%, depending on which year you use your starting point, down to about 10% really quickly in less than a decade. And you've got countries all over the world where digital payments still account for a tiny, tiny share of payments. Cash payments are about 50 or 60%. Well, what happens if those countries go through the same process that Sweden had? And it's one of those sort of things. If I say to someone, it may sound crazy, but somewhere like India, imagine if in India in 10 years' time, only 10 or 15, 20% of payments were cash, you'd think I was crazy. But that's exactly what has happened in Sweden in the past decade. And why can't it happen elsewhere? Because the technology is available. More people have mobile phones across the world than ever before. And the improvements in these technologies making this happen. And I think what we're going into in the course of the next decade is this massive multi-year boom in global digital payments as cash usage slowly fades out.
Yeah, but what happens to emerging markets? Because when you speak, it seems as if you're referring to the Western world. What happens in the emerging markets?
I think what you're seeing there is this big leap forwards. You've got a lot of people in the emerging world who don't have access to a bank account today. And actually, what I think we're going to see in the course of the next decade is that change quite dramatically because of the advent of mobile money. And
Yeah,
for a long time, we thought about how a bank account has to be a physical branch, and you have to go there and you have to set up an account. That whole sort of process and that digital adoption, that payments adoption story is a fundamentally different one when you start thinking about mobile money. And what you're seeing in parts of Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa and a little bit in Latin America is people getting access to digital payments through their mobile phone. And in these emerging markets, yes, mobile phone adoption is lower than it is in the developed world, but it's actually not that much lower, particularly amongst younger generations, where the adoption rates of smartphones in some emerging markets is as high as 90% amongst under 25s. And actually, if you take that together with this steady shift towards a digital economy, young people's trends really matter in terms of pushing that as well. Well, actually, I think we could see this really sharp drop in cash usage in much of the emerging world in the course of the next decade. And I think it's going to be a fascinating thing that happens because in the emerging world, that has an enormous multiplier effect on economic growth because you're streamlining the economy. You're taking out wastage and you're providing people with an opportunity then to get credit or to have savings or investments and all of those things that are genuinely transformational for economic growth. And there's not many good things that have come out of the last 12 months. But if one of them is that we accelerate the move towards digital payments, particularly in the emerging world, that I think is genuinely good news for the global economy.
I agree. And what's your perspective on cryptocurrency?
No, we don't have a published view on them. We've written a lot about central bank digital currencies instead, which I think are a lot more relevant in terms of the way we think about things as economists. And I think that's a really interesting space and one that is probably a little bit under discussed. And it's something where digital payments are. As digital payments increase, central banks across the world are looking at what's happening with cryptocurrencies. They're looking at what's happening in the stablecoin space, and central banks themselves are thinking of developing their own forms of digital payments. And I think that's an interesting space. We don't know what they're going to look like yet. We don't know how they're going to work. We don't know how the interaction is going to be with cryptocurrencies and traditional forms of payment. There's pilots in China and in Sweden that are well worth watching and see how they come out. But it's a very interesting space. And I think as more and more payments across the world go digital and more people have access to a mobile phone and the internet, there's going to be a lot more forms of payments that are going to be out there. And I think whilst a lot of these cryptocurrencies and so on get a lot of the press, the actual adoption rates and so on is considerably higher amongst the sort of more traditional forms of payments. And I think that sort of story is maybe a little bit underrepresented. The idea that people getting digital payments in India or Indonesia and Nigeria, that is considerably more important to the world than what happens with the Bitcoin price.
Yeah, I understand. And would you say that digital currencies are definitely the future of money?
I think so. I think it's very, very hard for me to be in any way positive about physical payments. I think cash is a problem for everyone. And in the simplest sense, if you're a consumer, cash is a problem because you risk losing it, either by accident or in more unfortunate circumstances. It's also a pain. You actually have to go and spend time getting it out of an ATM to then use it. There's so much wastage involved in a cash transaction when you think about it. But then for businesses, it's a real burden. So cash has a essentially a lot of fixed costs. So if I pay for cash in a shop, they have to store it, they have to count it, they have to take it to the bank. All of those things are fixed, almost regardless of how much cash takings they take in a day. So what ends up happening is you get this sort of tipping point where businesses start to realize that the marginal cost of a cash payment is really, really high. And so if you're taking $10,000 in a day and then you suddenly take $1,000 in a day in cash, the marginal cost of that cash payment is obscene. So what you end up doing is you then stop accepting cash payments. And that's essentially what's happened in Sweden over the last decade, is that move has played out over time. And it really accelerates that demise. So I'm very optimistic that digital payments are going to boom. The form of that digital payment will vary by country. In some places, we're seeing that some cryptocurrencies are playing a bigger role in those, but that's a tiny, tiny share of payments still. It's more so likely to be what we think of as a more traditional digital payments, and maybe central bank digital currencies playing a bigger role in that further down the line.
Definitely. And will the digital economy accelerate financial inclusion on a global scale?
I hope so. I really, really hope so. And to what I was just saying about this ability for mobile money to get people um, sort of active in the banking sector, give people a bank account, I think is absolutely amazing. And if you do see central banks engaging in central bank digital currency projects to try and increase financial inclusion, if you read reports from the BIS, they're saying that one of the top reasons for emerging market central banks to think about their own digital currencies is for financial inclusion reasons. I think it's a huge lever. And if that can happen, and if we can see more people get banked, then as I said, the impact that that could have on the world is enormous, not just in terms of economic growth, the way that we would traditionally think about as an economist, but also socially. Giving people access to secure savings, giving people access to credit is massive. And I'm very, very sort of optimistic about what this could mean for the world. And I am generally more of an optimistic person, but I think it's fascinating that these things could happen.
Yes. And in your capacity as a global economist, what are some of the challenges that you foresee for the global digital economy?
There's a few things. One of them is going to be taxes. We don't know how digital taxes get worked out, but when things can move across borders incredibly easily, trying to work out where the taxes are due is a huge problem. We're seeing this in a lot of disputes across countries at the moment, and it's something that's not going to go away until there is some sort of global, universal sort of agreement on digital taxes. It's a big issue and it's going to hang around. The other challenges, I think, are going to be around sort of policy from governments. And I think the biggest risk is that governments don't do their part, which is essentially providing digital networks. It's going to be putting in fast internet, making internet available for everyone at a reliable, fast speed. And that is going to be investment in 4G networks, 5G networks, fiber broadband networks, those sorts of things. That's really, really key. And the countries who don't do that are going to fall behind. It's all fair and well me saying mobile payments are going to be fantastic boosts to emerging market growth. But if emerging market governments don't put in 4G and 5G networks, then it's much, much harder for that to happen. And that's a key part of it. And it's not just about the payment side of this. If you think about someone in some of the poorest parts of the world getting a smartphone for the first time, what that access gives you is unbelievable. Then what it gives you in terms of news, which sounds so simple, but what that means in terms of your availability of information, how to do your job better, how to do best practice. There's a great example in India of an app that the Indian government released for farmers that gave them essentially simple information such as how much crops were going for at the local markets. They knew when to take their crops to the market, and giving them information such as the weather forecast. Yes, things like that are genuinely transformational in the very simplest terms. You also think about what this can do in terms of lifting education rates. Having access to elite level education online, it can genuinely transform the prospects of people in some of the poorest parts of the world. And on the healthcare front as well, you've seen this a lot in the last year. Just that information spread is so valuable, that what it can do in terms of lifting up potential growth. I'm extremely optimistic about the role that the smartphone will essentially play in lifting the global economy in the next 10 years. The challenge, as I say, though, is you've got to put those networks in. If you don't put the networks in, that can't happen. The handset prices are collapsing. They're affordable for pretty much everyone on the planet right now. The problem is, can you get those networks in place? And the progress has been good. It's been very good, but it just needs to continue for this to happen. If it doesn't, then some of that optimism has to be tainted a little bit.
Yes. So I know you made a lot of suggestions in terms of the policies, but I'm really still worried about the emerging markets because the truth is when COVID came and I look back and I even look back at Ghana and I know some people, they were not able to go to school for a whole year when people in the West were already taking part in e-learning activities. So how exactly are we going to convince governments to put these policies at the forefront of their agenda?
It's a very good question. And I think actually the pandemic could act as an accelerant on that front, because I think a lot of governments in the emerging world have realized the importance of having a digitally connected economy. It's become abundantly clear in the last year. And you can see this really clearly in the sort of, not necessarily the willingness, but the ability to put in any form of social distancing policies. Now, it's all fair and well for the UK government to say everyone needs to work at home. But as you say, that's just not possible. Or it's not possible for kids to not go to school because there's no alternative. And actually, the investments, therefore, in the digital technology, making sure that access to internet or a mobile device or a basic laptop or whatever it needs to be, the multipliers of that investment are greater than they've ever been, and they will continue to be enormous. And I think actually what the pandemic could act as is a real accelerant for governments across the world, in the emerging and the developed world, because it's not just in the emerging world where you've got this problem, it's in the poorest parts of developed world as well, where you've got this huge inequality problem where low-income households don't have access to the devices for their kids to learn at home, whereas high-income households do. And though that inequality problem is been really widened out by the pandemic, but it's created an incentive for governments to fix it. And what I'd love to see is much more investment in digital technology, both in terms of the top end of it, can we get sort of fast internet into our countries, but also making sure it's a universal right, that everyone in the world has access to a digital device that's connected to the internet at a price that's very, very affordable to them. And if their progress goes in that direction, which, as I say, it's a long way from being there, but the hope is that we get that progress, then that gives you reason for optimism. And the impact on economic growth and on social well-being comes at a lag, because you need to get everyone with a smartphone, then you get the benefits. And we're hopefully in that transition phase where more and more people are getting these devices, and then the benefits come afterwards. Because again, like I said with this payment story, you then hit some tipping points in the other direction, where you've got a certain amount of people who have got access to this technology. Then you can start creating apps for people, be it in Ghana, where you have sort of the education system can create online learning. Well, that can only really, there's any value in doing that if you have a certain share of people who have access to devices. And those sorts of things can happen much more quickly. And so, yes, the pandemic has opened up the problem that where we are today in terms of that digital inequality, but it's given everyone a massive reason to change that going forwards. And I'm quite hopeful that we do see some substantial progress on that front in the coming years.
Most definitely. And what's your message to our audience, James?
My message is quite simple. Firstly, don't underestimate how much things can change. You just have to, people always say, now I write a lot of things as an economist about what's going to happen in the next 10 years. And people always say to me that the numbers and the forecasts and things I put in, what the world's going to be like in 2030 seem mad. But I would say to people, just go back 10 years. Think how much the world has changed in 10 years, and think how much it could change going forwards. We're in a world today where if I'd said to you, after this, I'm going to go to a shop and buy a flight, you'd say I was crazy. But 10 years ago, that would have been pretty standard behavior.
Yeah.
The idea, I use Spotify as an example in our discussion. It's something like that. It's just completely changed the way we think about music. We've had all sorts of jobs that have created in the last couple of years that we never thought would be possible. And things are going to keep changing at that rapid rate as we go forwards. And what the arrival of everyone being connected in the developed world, and I think will happen as more and more people are connected in the emerging world happens, is you're going to see more and more ideas come out. You're going to see more creativity. It creates, everyone has a platform direct to the world. And that in itself is going to mean a lot more innovation than we can even comprehend. And that's fantastic. And I think with the simple message in one line is don't underestimate how fast change can happen. I think that's something we're going to see in the next decade.
Beautiful. Thanks for sharing. James, I really learned a lot about the digital economy, and I'm sure our audience has learned a lot. Thank you for sharing this enlightening information with us.
Pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
You're welcome. Cheers.
Great. Cheers.
Thanks for tuning in on Experts Connect. Please head on over to teachsomebody.com and give us an applause. You may share your comments and ask your questions in the comment section. Please subscribe to us on YouTube as well as follow us on Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts. You can also follow me on Instagram at Davis-Owusu. Have a lovely rest of the week. Bye.